December 16, 1944. A frozen field outside Crinkled, Belgium. The world was reduced to a monochrome hell of white snow and black smoke. Inside the M4A3 Sherman Avenging Angel, the air was a solid, suffocating thing, thick with the smells of cordite, diesel, fear sweat, and the electric tang of spent shells. The heat from the engine block was a brutal mockery of the sub-zero cold outside, cooking the crew inside their steel coffin. Eli Vance's world was the rubber eyepiece of his M4 periscope, his body braced against the gunner's seat, the constant, jarring tremors of the tank vibrating up through his spine. A deafening whump sounded 50 yards to their left. Earth and frozen sod rained down on the hull like hail. Through his scope, Eli saw the aftermath. Their platoon mate, Bad Betty, was a burning pyre, orange flames licking from every hatch, ammunition cooking off in pops and cracks. Bad Betty is gone. She's gone. Babyface Garcia's voice was a high-pitched crack over the intercom. Shut up, Garcia. Driver, reverse. Slow. Get us behind that wreck. Sergeant Donnie Top Kolchak's command was a gravelly roar, the only solid thing left in the universe. Pittsburgh Pete threw the Sherman into reverse. The transmission groaned in protest, the tracks churning mud and snow. They'd barely moved 10 yards when the world dissolved into a shrieking, metallic scream. A German 75mm shell from a Panzer IV they hadn't seen slammed into their forward glacis plate. The impact was a physical blow, a cathedral bell ringing inside the hull. Eli's teeth rattled in his skull. A shower of paint chips and internal spalling, tiny daggers of metal, ricocheted around the fighting compartment. Frontal armor held. No penetration. Top yelled, a desperate edge to his voice. Traverse right. Gunner. Target. Panzer IV, 300 yards, just past the burning haystack. Eli's hands, slick with sweat, flew over the controls. He cranked the hand wheel for the turret traverse. The electric motor whined, the gears grinding with a hated, familiar sloppiness. He was fighting the machine as much as the enemy. He settled the crosshairs, the T-19 telescope's view jittering with the tank's movement. He stomped on the firing pedal. The 75mm roared, the breech slamming back in a cloud of smoke. The shell streaked across the field and struck the Panzer IV's turret, a glancing blow that sparked but failed to penetrate. Again. Hit him again. Top screamed. But Eli was no longer looking at the Panzer IV. Through the smoke and mist, a new shape emerged. It was larger, lower, and moved with a predatory, inexorable grace. Its long, overpowering 88mm gun barrel swept across the battlefield like the finger of God. Tiger! Pittsburgh Pete breathed over the intercom, the word a prayer and a curse. No, Eli corrected, his voice hollow, the blood draining from his face. That's not a tiger. That's a king tiger. The Königstiger. It was a monster, a slab-sided behemoth that made their Sherman look like a toy. It was 1,500 yards away, an impossible range for their 75mm to do anything but scratch the paint. The King Tiger's turret stopped. Its massive gun barrel began to depress, centering on them. Time stretched, snapped thin. Eli could hear the whine of their own engine, the hyperventilating gasps of Garcia, the ticking of cooling metal. He could smell the ozone from their last shot, the coppery taste of his own terror. The King Tiger's muzzle flashed, a sun-bright blossom of orange. The sound reached them a split second later, not a sharp crack, but a vast, tearing roar of air. The 88mm shell passed so close overhead the overpressure waves slammed their heads against the interior steel. They were bracketed. The next shot would not miss. Driver, flank, left, go. Top yelled, his voice cracking. I'm trying. We're stuck in the mud. Pete cried, the Sherman lurching but not gaining purchase. The King Tiger's gun began its minute adjustments for the kill shot. Inside the Avenging Angel, it was the moment of the gallows. Eli Vance looked at the standard, inadequate gunner's controls. He looked at the photograph of his brother taped next to his scope. And then he moved. His hands abandoned the traditional hand wheels. In a fluid, practiced motion, they found the strange, jerry-rigged apparatus he had built, a series of polished levers connected to the hull traverse linkage, A custom-built optic with a longer focal length scavenged from a wrecked M10 tank destroyer, a micro-adjustable trigger he'd machined himself. "Pete," Eli said, his voice unervingly calm, a still point in the hurricane. "I need you to traverse the hull. 5 degrees left. On my mark." Top Kolchak tore his eyes from his vision blocks, staring down into the gunner's station. His face was a mask of sheer, uncomprehending disbelief. "Eli," he snarled, "what in God's name are you doing? Get on the goddamn controls." The King Tiger's 88mm was locked on them. There was no time. Before we see if this desperate heretical act of one gunner saves his crew or condemns them, make sure you're subscribed. What you're about to witness defies every tank doctrine ever written. Subscribe now, because the story of how a Pennsylvania farm boy turned a 30-ton steel box into a precision instrument is one you won't believe. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, 1938. The air was thick and golden, heavy with the scent of sun-baked earth, cut hay, and the rich, dark odor of engine oil. The only sounds were the drone of cicadas in the distant oak trees and the steady, puttering heartbeat of the family's John Deere Model A tractor. Eli Vance, 16 years old and already with the strong, calloused hands of a man, lay on his back in the cool dirt beneath the machine. A complex mechanical seed drill was disassembled around him, its gears and planting plates laid out on a clean canvas cloth with a meticulous, almost reverent order. "The problem isn't the main drive shaft," Eli's voice was muffled under the tractor's bulk. "It's the transfer box. The pinion gear is worn. It's got play." His father, Samuel Vance, stood above him, a shadow blocking the sun. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of sun and stoicism. He grunted, a sound that could mean anything from agreement to dismissal. "Play can be fixed with a bigger hammer," he rumbled, a mantra Eli had heard his whole life. "Or a better shim," Eli countered, sliding out from under the tractor, his coveralls streaked with grease. He held up a small, precisely machined brass washer. "This one's too thick. Throws the alignment off by 0.03. It'll wear out the new pinion in a season." Samuel grunted again, but this time there was a flicker of something in his eyes, not quite understanding, but a respect for the result. Eli's world was one of tangible problems and tangible solutions. A busted hydraulic line, a misfiring cylinder, a warped plowshare. These were things you could see, touch, and fix. There was a profound honesty in it. But it was in his grandfather's workshop where Eli learned a different language, the language of silence and infinitesimal perfection. The workshop was a sacred space, a small, clapboard shed that smelled of lemon oil, metal polish, and old wood. Here, the world was measured in thousandths of an inch. Elias Vance Sr., his hands gnarled like old tree roots but still impossibly steady, presided over a kingdom of ticking clocks. "The mainspring is not the heart of the clock, Eli," the old man whispered, his eye pressed to a jeweler's loop. His voice was as soft as the tick of the regulator wall clock he was repairing. "The heart is the balance wheel. It is the regulator. Without its precise, unwavering rhythm, the entire mechanism is just noise." He guided Eli's hands, teaching him to feel the subtle drag of a poorly oiled pivot, to hear the faintest whisper of a bent tooth scraping against a pallet fork. "Precision, Eli," he would say, tapping a finger on his grandson's temple. "It is the difference between noise and music, between chaos and purpose. It is a form of respect, for the materials, for the design, for the truth of the thing itself." This orderly world of gears and spring tension was shattered on a Sunday afternoon in December 1941. The family was gathered around the large Philco radio in the parlor, the smell of roast chicken still hanging in the air. The news bulletin crackled through the speaker, the announcer's voice tight with a panic that felt alien, a distant storm suddenly roaring onto their quiet shore. "Pearl Harbor. Attack. Battleships sunk." Eli's older brother, Michael, shot to his feet. His face, usually split by an easy, charming grin, was set in hard, furious lines. "Those sons of bitches," he'd whispered, then louder. "I'm going. I'm enlisting tomorrow." The following week was a blur of goodbyes. Michael, looking impossibly handsome and grown up in his new Army Air Forces uniform, clapped Eli on the shoulder. "Hold the fort down, little brother. I'll write. I'll be back before you know it, a regular hero." He winked, but his eyes were serious. The farmhouse felt emptier after he left, the silence where his laughter had been a constant, aching presence. Months passed. Letters arrived, filled with tales of training in Texas, the vastness of the sky, the power of the B-17 flying fortress he was to crew. He called his plane the Liberty's Kiss. Then, the letters stopped. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. The government regretted to inform them. His B-17 was lost over the English Channel. Missing, presumed dead. There were no remains to bury. No closure. His mother crumpled, her sobs the only sound in the suddenly cavernous house. His father walked out to the barn and didn't come back until well after dark, his face a stone mask, his eyes red-rimmed. Eli stood in Michael's empty room, a hollowed-out shell. The war was no longer a distant abstraction. It was the silence in the hallway, the broken look in his mother's eyes, the ghost that sat in his brother's chair at the dinner table. Vengeance was a cold, useless stone in his gut. But purpose was something else. His own draft notice came 3 months later. He held the crisp, official paper in his hand, standing in his grandfather's workshop. His gaze fell on the regulator clock, its pendulum swinging back and forth with metronomic certainty. Tick, tock, tick, tock. He looked at the photograph of Michael, forever young, forever smiling, tucked into the corner of the clock's frame. He picked up a delicate gear from his grandfather's bench, feeling its perfect teeth, the smoothness of its rotation. He wouldn't be a brawler. He wouldn't add to the chaos. He would bring order. He would bring precision. He made a promise, not to the walls, not to God, but to the ghost of his brother. A vow sealed in the language of mechanics and memory. I will fix this. Fort Benning, Georgia, 1943. The heat was different here. It wasn't the dry, benevolent warmth of the Pennsylvania sun on a hayfield. This was a thick, wet blanket that clung to the skin, soaked the woolen uniform, and made every breath taste of red clay and pine resin. The air throbbed with a new industrial symphony, the staccato crack of rifle fire from distant ranges, the guttural roar of tank engines, and the constant shouted cadence of drill sergeants. Eli Vance stood at parade rest, his duffel bag at his feet, amidst a sea of other young men whose faces mirrored a mixture of anxiety, bravado, and sheer dislocation. He felt the weight of the hidden toolbox in his pack, a secret nestled between socks and underwear. The finely machined calipers, the custom-ground screwdrivers, the small vials of specialized lubricant. They were his talismans, a link to the ordered world he'd left behind. "Vance," a corporal barked, checking a clipboard. "Your mechanics. Armored. Follow the yellow footprints." He was herded onto a truck with a dozen others and driven deep into the base, to a vast, dusty motor pool that stretched to the horizon. And there, row upon row, sat the machines that would win the war. The M4 Sherman. At first glance, it was impressive. It had a rugged, purposeful look, with its sloping front hull and its turret sitting high and proud. It was named, he learned, for a Union general from the Civil War. It looked like what a tank should look like. Then he climbed inside. The fighting compartment was cramped, a claustrophobic ballet of steel, optics, and lethal machinery. It smelled of cosmoline, new paint, and sweat. Eli ran his hands over the gunner's station. His hands, which could feel the wear in a tractor's pinion gear, which could reassemble a clock's escapement blindfolded, immediately recoiled at what they found. The hand wheels for traverse and elevation had play. A good quarter-inch of loose, dead rotation before the gears even engaged. The T-19 telescopic sight was serviceable, but its field of view was narrow, a keyhole onto a chaotic world. The firing pedal was a crude, heavy switch, requiring a solid stomp that would inevitably jostle the entire aiming process. It was, to his senses, an instrument of brutal approximation, not precision. It was built for volume, for throwing enough metal downrange to hopefully hit something. It was a sledgehammer, and he was a man who understood scalpels. "Quite a beast, ain't she?" Eli turned. A sergeant stood there, a man with a Brooklyn accent you could cut with a knife and a grin that seemed permanently etched onto his face. He had the stripes of a tank commander on his sleeve. "Name's Kolchak." Donnie Kolchak. But you'll call me Top or Sarge. This here, he said, slapping the Sherman's hull with a loud clang, is your new home. You must be Vance. They tell me you're a whiz with anything that has moving parts. He looked Eli up and down. You got the hands for it. I got the mouth. We'll get along. Top introduced the rest of the crew. Pittsburgh Pete, the driver and bow gunner, a wiry man with nervous eyes that constantly darted around, already memorizing every bolt and wire. And Babyface Garcia, the loader, whose youthful face beamed with an eagerness that hadn't yet been tempered by the reality of what their job entailed. We're the Avenging Angel, Top announced, as if bestowing a royal title. Because we're gonna deliver some heavenly punishment to any Nazi son of a gun dumb enough to get in our way. They trained for weeks. They learned to drive, to load, to communicate in the frantic, abbreviated slang of tankers. They fired the 75 millimeters on the range. Eli learned the drill: traverse, estimate range, lead the target, fire. The gun was loud, violent, and imprecise. At 500 yards, they could hit a target tank. At 800, it was a gamble. At 1,000, it was a prayer. It was during a classroom briefing that the first cold knot of dread formed in Eli's stomach. A lieutenant, pointer in hand, stood before a chalkboard diagram of a German tank. It was blocky, angular, and dominated by a long, terrifying gun. This, the lieutenant said, tapping the diagram, is the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger. It weighs 56 tons. Its frontal armor is 100 millimeters thick. Your 75 millimeters gun-firing standard M61 shot can penetrate approximately 70 millimeters of armor at 500 yards. Do the math. The classroom was silent. The lieutenant continued, his voice grim. Your doctrine is mobility and numbers. Get on its flanks. Hit it with multiple tanks at once. Get close. Because if you face one head-on at anything beyond point-blank range. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That night, Eli lay in his bunk, the sounds of the barracks a dull roar around him. He saw the diagram of the Tiger. He felt the slop in the gunner's controls. He heard his grandfather's voice, the difference between noise and music. What they were being taught was noise. Deafening, wasteful, lethal noise. He reached into his duffel and felt the cool, hard metal of his toolbox. A plan, dangerous and heretical, began to take shape in his mind. It was a whisper against the shouted doctrine of the entire U.S. Army. Weeks later, they stood on the deck of a troopship, the shores of America a fading green line on the horizon. The air was cold and salty. The sea churned around them, a vast, gray emptiness. Pittsburgh Pete was already looking seasick. Babyface Garcia was uncharacteristically quiet, staring at the water. Top Kolchak leaned on the rail next to Eli, his usual grin absent. Big ocean, kid, Top said softly. Eli didn't answer. His hand rested on his pack, feeling the solid shape of the tools within. He wasn't looking at the ocean. He was looking back, toward the watchmaker's quiet shop, the orderly fields, the ghost of a brother who promised to write. He had made a promise. And he was bringing the only weapons he truly understood. Normandy, France. July 1944. The bocage was a green hell. Not the hell of fire and brimstone, but one of claustrophobia and sudden, violent death. The avenging angel nosed its way down a narrow lane, its tracks chewing deep furrows into the damp, black earth. Hedgerows, ancient, tangled walls of earth and root rising 15 feet high, crowded in on either side, their leaves dripping with a constant, cold condensation. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. The world had shrunk to a tunnel of green, the sky a thin, gray strip above. Inside the tank, the atmosphere was a physical pressure. The roar of the Continental engine was a constant, deafening presence, vibrating through the steel floor and into their bones. The air was a foul brew of diesel fumes, the coppery scent of hot brass from spent shell casings, and the pungent, animal smell of men who had not slept or bathed in days. Sweat soaked through their coveralls, tracing clean lines through the grime on their faces. Gunner, Cokes. Tree lean, top of the hedgerow. 200 yards. Infantry. Top's voice was a raw scrape over the intercom, strained from days of shouting. Eli's eyes were glued to his periscope. He saw movement, a flicker of gray, the shape of a helmet. He stomped the pedal for the coaxial Browning M1919. The .30 caliber machine gun chattered to life, its staccato rhythm a violent counterpoint to the engine's drone. Tracers ripped into the foliage, sending leaves and wood splinters flying. A German soldier tumbled from the hedgerow, a dark bundle falling into the ditch. They had been doing this for hours. Advancing a few yards, blasting a suspected position with the 75mm or the machine guns, then waiting, hearts pounding, for the return fire that always came. It was a brutal, grinding war of attrition fought in a labyrinth. Driver, halt. Loader, he. Gunner, see that farmhouse? The one with the collapsed roof? Window on the second floor. Identified, Eli confirmed, his voice a monotone. He cranked the traverse wheel, fighting the hated slack. The turret groaned left. He elevated the barrel, estimating the range. 400 yards. He stomped the firing pedal. The tank bucked violently as the 75mm roared. The high-explosive shell smashed through the stone wall of the farmhouse, erupting in a flash of orange and a cloud of dust and debris. A cheer started to form in Garcia's throat, but it died as a sound like a giant ripping canvas tore the air apart. A shell from a hidden German anti-tank gun screamed past their turret, missing by inches and obliterating the hedgerow behind them in an explosion of dirt and shredded vegetation. Contact! Tank. Or pack. 3 o'clock. Top screamed. Driver. Hard reverse. Gunner, scan. Eli frantically traversed the turret, his world a spinning blur of green and fear through the scope. He couldn't see it. The damn hedgerows hid everything. Another round hit the ground in front of them, throwing a geyser of earth over the bow, momentarily blinding Pittsburgh Pete. Then, from a parallel lane to their right, a Sherman from their own company, Desert Devil, emerged, its hull exposed as it tried to flank the enemy gun. It happened in an instant. A bolt of white-hot tungsten from a high-velocity German gun, a Panther, they would learn later, punched through Desert Devil's side armor with a sound like a sledgehammer on a tin can. There was no explosion at first, just a horrific, inward rupture. Then, a secondary flash, orange and terrible, blew the turret clean off its race. It landed upside down in a field 20 feet away, burning. The hull of the tank instantly became a furnace, the ammunition inside cooking off in a series of pops and bangs, a final, dreadful fireworks display. No one got out. The avenging angel was silent. The only sound was the idle of their own engine. The smell of burning diesel, cordite, and roasted meat washed over them, seeping through the vision slits. Garcia retched violently into a corner. Eli stared, paralyzed, at the burning wreck. Those were men he'd eaten with last night. They were just gone. Erased. Not by superior tactics, but by a better, more accurate gun fired from a hidden position. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Later, in a quiet apple orchard granted a temporary, fragile reprieve, the crew sat in stunned silence. The scent of rotting apples mixed nauseatingly with the lingering stench of death on their clothes and in the tank. Eli climbed out, his legs shaky. He walked a few paces away and vomited into the grass. When he returned, he didn't look at his crewmates. He stared into the dark, open maw of the avenging angel's turret. He saw the gunner's seat, the imprecise controls, the instrument of their potential demise. He saw the charred, blackened stain on the grass where they'd hosed out the interior. He reached into his duffel and pulled out his personal toolbox. The metal felt cool and certain in his hands. He walked over to Top Kolchak, who was leaning against a tank track, smoking a cigarette with a trembling hand. "Top," Eli said, his voice quiet but cutting through the evening stillness. "The way we're doing this, it's wrong." He looked from Top's exhausted face to the gutted hull of the Desert Devil, its blackened skeleton silhouetted against the twilight. "It's getting men killed." The French orchard was preternaturally quiet in the early morning mist, the air cool and carrying the sweet, cloying scent of rotting apples. It was a stark, almost offensive contrast to the memory of burning metal and flesh. The crew of the Avenging Angel sat on the ground, a silent, exhausted circle around Eli as he laid out his tools on an oil-stained canvas. The core of his heresy lay disassembled before them. The standard gunner's hand grips, the firing pedal, and in their place, a series of polished levers and linkages he had fabricated in the motor pool under the cover of night. "It's about the slop," Eli began, his voice low but intense, his gaze fixed on Top Kolchak. "The turret traverse is electric. It's fast, but it's vague. It's for getting the gun roughly on target. The hand wheels for fine adjustment have a quarter turn of dead space. You're always fighting it, especially when the hull isn't level." He picked up a long, lever-like apparatus. This connects directly to the hull traverse linkage. The hull traverse is hydraulic, driven by the engine. It's slower, yeah, but it's mechanical, direct. There's almost no play. If Pete can keep the hull steady, I can use this lever to make micro-adjustments, tiny, precise shifts in the entire tank's orientation that the turret traverse can't match. Pittsburgh Pete, the driver, looked horrified. "You want me to aim the whole damn tank? While you're yelling in my ear? On a bumpy field? That's insane." "It's not insane," Eli countered, his patience that of a teacher explaining a fundamental principle. "It's just different. You become my fine adjustment wheel. I call the direction. You tap the brakes and nudge the steering levers. We'll practice. It'll become rhythm." He then held up a new optic, a longer, more slender telescope he'd salvaged and recalibrated. "The T-19 has a narrow field of view. This one gives me more magnification. I can see the target better, further out." Finally, he showed them the custom trigger, a small, brass mechanism that replaced the heavy firing pedal. "This connects to the firing solenoid. No more stomping. A gentle squeeze. It eliminates the last little jar." Top Kolchak had listened in silence, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. He finally spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're talking about rewriting the entire U.S. Army tank crewman's manual, Vance. You want to turn my driver into a part-time gunner. You want to bypass every certified tested control in this vehicle for a bunch of clockwork you built in a shed." "I'm talking about not ending up like Desert Devil," Eli said, his own voice gaining an edge. He pointed a grease-blackened finger at the standard controls. "That system is designed for brawling. It's for getting in close and hoping. The Germans don't brawl. They snipe. That Panther was 1,000 yards away. With this," he gestured to his creation, "with this, we can snipe back." The silence returned, thicker now. Garcia looked between Eli and Top, his young face torn. Pete stared at his hands, contemplating the new, terrifying responsibility. Top's eyes were locked on Eli's, measuring the farm boy's certainty against the weight of Army doctrine and the lives of his crew. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of a man conceding to a reality he hated. He walked over and picked up the custom trigger, feeling its delicate, precise action. "You get one chance to prove this voodoo, Eli," Top said, his eyes hard. "One field test. One engagement. If it doesn't work, if it slows us down, if we miss a shot we should have made, if it gets so much as a scratch on Garcia's pretty face, we tear it all out. We do it by the book. My book. Understood." Eli met his commander's gaze and gave a single, firm nod. His fate, and that of his crew, was now irrevocably tied to the polished metal in his hands. The opportunity for Eli's one chance came 2 days later, near the shattered town of St. Lo. The American infantry advance had ground to a halt, pinned down in a ditch-lined field by the relentless, ripping sound of a German MG-42 machine gun nest. The weapon, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw, for its terrifying 200-round-per-minute rate of fire, had turned the field into a killing zone. From their position on a slight rise, the crew of the Avenging Angel had a clear view of the situation. "There," Top said, his binoculars pressed to his eyes. "See the farmhouse with the half-collapsed chimney? The buzzsaw's in the ground floor, firing from a loophole in the stone wall. 800 yards. Another Sherman, Iron Maiden, was already engaging. It fired 2 quick rounds from its 75 millimeters. The first shell struck the wall a foot to the left of the loophole, showering it with stone dust. The second sailed high, exploding harmlessly against the roof. The MG-42 never stopped its lethal chatter. "They're wasting ammo," Eli said, his voice calm. He was already settled into his gunner's seat, his hands on his custom levers, his eye pressed to the scavenged, higher magnification optic. The world outside narrowed to a crystal-clear circle centered on the dark, flashing slit in the stone wall. Iron Maidens pulling back. "They can't hit it," Pittsburgh Pete reported, his voice tight with anxiety over the intercom. "Angel, this is Baker Company. Can you suppress that position?" "Over." A frantic voice crackled over the radio. Top keyed the mic, his eyes locked on Eli. "Baker Company, stand by. We are engaging." He released the button. "You hear that, Eli? The floor is yours. Don't screw it up." The unspoken weight of the entire platoon, of the men dying in that field, pressed down on them. Eli took a slow, deep breath. The sounds of the battlefield, the distant rifle fire, the moans of the wounded carried on the wind, the idling rumble of their own engine, faded into a dull background hum. Inside his head, it was as quiet as his grandfather's workshop. "Pete," Eli said, his tone hypnotically steady. "Traverse hull. 2 degrees right. Very slow." "Traversing 2 degrees right, slow," Pete repeated, his hands white-knuckled on the steering levers. The entire 30-ton tank began to pivot infinitesimally on its tracks. Eli watched the crosshairs drift across the stone wall. He could see the individual stones, the chipped edge of the loophole, the occasional muzzle flash from within the darkness. "Stop." The tank ceased moving. The crosshairs were steady, just a hair to the left of the target. This was the moment. This was where the standard traverse would have failed, the slop in the gears causing an overcorrection. "Now, Pete. Tap the left brake. 1%. On my mark." He waited, feeling the rhythm of the machine, the pulse of his own heart. "Mark." A barely perceptible shudder ran through the hull as Pete feathered the brake. The tank nudged a fraction of a degree. In Eli's scope, the crosshairs slid with mechanical perfection, settling directly over the center of the dark loophole. There was no stomp, no violent lurch. Eli's index finger merely applied gentle, increasing pressure to the custom brass trigger. The squeeze was smooth, deliberate. The 75 mm roared, the concussion wave punching through the compartment. The breech slammed back, ejecting a smoking brass casing that clanged at Garcia's feet. But Eli never lost his sight picture. He watched the entire flight of the high-explosive shell, a blur streaking across the 800 yards of open field. Time seemed to hang for a single, eternal second. Then, impact. The shell did not strike near the loophole. It did not strike the wall. It flew straight and true, like a bullet from a sniper's rifle, and vanished directly into the narrow, dark opening. There was a flash of light from within the farmhouse, a bright, contained glare, followed a microsecond later by a deep, thunderous whump as the explosion blew the entire front wall of the ground floor outward. Stones, timber, and pieces of the machine gun were hurled into the air. The relentless buzzsaw fell silent, replaced by an eerie, ringing quiet. Inside the avenging angel, the only sound was the hum of the electronics and the heavy breathing of the crew. No one spoke. Garcia stared at the smoking breech, his mouth agape. Pete slowly released his death grip on the steering levers. Top Kolchak lowered his binoculars. He stared at the destroyed farmhouse, then down at the back of Eli's helmet. When he finally spoke, his voice was a mixture of awe, disbelief, and the dawning of a new, terrifying possibility. Holy hell! Winter had fallen with a vengeance, transforming the world into a monochrome prison of white and gray. The once vibrant green of the Ardennes was buried under 2 feet of snow, the trees standing as skeletal sentinels, their branches glazed with ice. Inside the avenging angel, the cold was a more insidious enemy than the Germans. It seeped through the steel hull, numbing fingers and toes, and condensed on every metal surface, forming a thin, treacherous layer of ice. The heater fought a losing battle, filling the compartment with the smell of scorched dust without providing any real warmth. They had been holding a stretch of the Elsenborn Ridge for a week, part of the thin American line that intelligence insisted was a quiet sector. But attention hung in the frozen air, a sense of impending storm that even the rawest replacement could feel. The crew had changed. The success of Eli's backward setup had not been a one-time miracle. It had become their doctrine. They had drilled relentlessly in lulls between patrols, Eli and Pittsburgh Pete developing a silent, almost telepathic communication. Pete's hands on the steering levers had become an extension of Eli's will, the hull of the Sherman now moving with the minute precision of a watchmaker's tool. They were no longer just the avenging angel. A name had started circulating among the infantry they supported and the other tank crews, spoken in hushed, reverent tones. They called them the Ghost. It began with a German Stu G3 assault gun that had gotten arrogant, sitting in a tree line over 1,000 yards away, shelling American positions with impunity. A standard Sherman platoon had tried to engage and been driven back by its accurate fire. The avenging angel had rolled into a concealed firing position, a dip in the terrain that only Eli's elevated optic could see over. Stu G3. 1,100 yards. Hull down behind the pine tree line, Top murmured, his breath pluming in the frozen air inside the turret. Eli went through the ritual. The quiet commands to Pete. The subtle, grinding adjustments of the hull. The world in his scope was a crystal-clear disk of white and green. He saw the commander's cupola of the Stu G, the vehicle perfectly still, confident in its range advantage. He didn't aim for the heavily sloped front armor. He placed the crosshairs on the thinner superstructure, just below the main gun. The single crack of their 75mm was startling in the muffled, snowy silence. The shell flew flat and fast, a gray streak against the white landscape. It struck the Stu G square where Eli had aimed. There was a flash, then smoke began pouring from the hatches. It never fired again. 2 days later, a German half-track, emboldened by the morning fog, tried to rush supplies to a forward outpost. It was a fleeting target, moving at speed at nearly 900 yards. For any other Sherman, it would have been a futile exercise. For Eli, it was a problem of geometry and timing. One high-explosive round turned the vehicle into a rolling fireball. The legend of the Ghost grew. The Germans in the sector became hesitant, nervous. They would report being engaged by a phantom American tank, its shots impossibly accurate, its location never seen. It was a weapon of psychological warfare as much as steel and high explosives. But on the morning of the 16th, the weather itself became the enemy. A thick, freezing fog rolled in, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. It was a white wall, swallowing sound and sight. The avenging angel was blind. "This is no good," Top grumbled, wiping condensation from his vision block. "We're sitting ducks in this. We can't see a thing." They were positioned at a critical crossroads, a key terrain feature outlined in their orders. They had to hold it. The fog was a blanket, smothering their only advantage. Inside the tank, the tension returned, the old, familiar fear of the close-range brawl they were never meant to win. For an hour, they heard nothing but the drip of melting ice inside the tank and the moan of the wind outside. Then, a new sound permeated the fog, a deep, guttural, grinding roar. It was the sound of heavy tank engines, many of them, growing steadily louder. The ground beneath them began to tremble. Pittsburgh Pete's voice was a terrified whisper over the intercom. "You hear that?" Then, the fog shifted. A momentary break in the impenetrable whiteness, a window granted by the capricious wind. And through it, Top saw what the intelligence reports had missed. What the quiet sector had hidden. It wasn't just a patrol. It was an entire spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division. And at its tip, nosing through the mist not 500 yards away, was the largest, most terrifying tank any of them had ever seen. Its long, overhanging 88mm gun, its sharply angled glassy plate, its immense, brutal bulk were like a visitation from another, more advanced war. "King Tiger," Eli said, the name a death sentence. The behemoth's turret stopped. Its massive gun began to traverse, not randomly, but with deliberate, hunting purpose. It had seen them. The Ghost had been found. The world snapped into a hyper-focused, brutal clarity. The brief window in the fog was gone, but the image of the Königstiger was burned into their retinas. The immense tank was now a spectral giant in the mist, its outline blurred but its presence a physical weight against the avenging angel's hull. Gunner. Target. King Tiger. 400 yards. Top's voice was a razor wire of controlled panic. Eli's hands were already on his custom levers. His eye pressed to the scope. But the target was no longer a stationary stooge or a speeding half-track. It was a moving fortress, its angled frontal armor presenting a near-impenetrable slope. In his magnified view, he could see the rough texture of the German Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste, the sturdy road wheels, the massive, deadly gun barrel swinging towards them. Pete, traverse hull. 10 degrees left. Now. Eli commanded. The Sherman's engine roared as Pete threw the steering levers. The tank began to pivot. But they were too slow. The King Tiger fired first. The sound was not just loud. It was a physical force. The 88mm shell tore through the air with a sound like the sky being ripped in half. It missed the turret by a miracle of miscalculation, but it struck the avenging angel on the left front drive sprocket. The impact was a deafening, catastrophic clang-bang of shearing metal. The tank lurched violently, throwing Eli against his scope and Garcia into the radio rack. A horrific, grinding noise replaced the healthy roar of their engine. The smell of burnt metal and hydraulic fluid flooded the compartment. "We're hit. We're hit." Pittsburgh Pete screamed. "Left track is gone. We're immobilized." They were trapped. Anchored in the snow, a perfect, stationary target. Through the vision blocks, they could see gray-clad figures, German panzer grenadiers, dismounting from accompanying half-tracks and beginning to advance, using the cover of the fog and the crippled Sherman's blind spots. "Bow gun. Keep that infantry off us." Top yelled, grabbing the .30 caliber from its rack and firing blindly through the pistol port. The King Tiger, knowing its prey was wounded, began to advance slowly, its engine a low, predatory growl. It was angling itself, presenting its thickest frontal armor, a knight confident in its invulnerability. "Eli, you got a shot." Top barked, his face streaked with sweat despite the freezing cold. "I need a flank shot. The front glacis is too angled." "Pete, can you traverse the hull?" "Just a few degrees. I need to see its side." Pete wrestled with the steering levers, but the final drive on the left side was shattered, locked in place by the wreckage of their track. The tank groaned but refused to budge. "I can't. The final drive is locked. We're stuck facing it head-on." Eli stared through his scope. The King Tiger was now 300 yards away and closing. It was a perfect, head-on profile. The driver's front plate, the massive gun mantlet, all impervious. He had nowhere to aim. His precision was useless against a wall of steel. He watched, helpless, as the King Tiger's turret made one last, tiny adjustment. The long 88mm barrel dipped infinitesimally, centering directly on their center of mass. There was no doubt. No margin for error. This was the end. The inside of the avenging angel became a tomb in waiting. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the crew and the relentless, ticking clock of the advancing German infantry. Garcia had stopped loading, his hands frozen on a shell, his eyes wide with the acceptance of his mortality. Top looked down at Eli, and in that moment there was no command to give, no order that could change their fate. The King Tiger had won the gambit. The massive German gun flashed. The world did not slow down. It accelerated, crystallizing into a single, razor-sharp point of existence. The King Tiger's muzzle flash was a sun blooming in the gray mist, a prelude to their annihilation. The 88mm shell, a projectile the size of a fire hydrant, crossed the 300 yards in a blink. It did not strike them. It screamed past the turret, so close the overpressure waves slammed the crew's heads against the interior steel and rattled the vision blocks in their housings. It had been a ranging shot. The next one would not miss. "He's got our range." Top yelled, the words shredded by adrenaline. But Eli was no longer there. He had retreated into the silent, ordered universe inside his own mind. The universe of gears and tolerances. The world outside, the grinding engine, the advancing infantry, the screaming panic, faded into a distant hum. His entire being was funneled into the circle of his custom optic. The king tiger filled the view, a monolithic slab of angled steel. It was a perfect, impossible problem. He couldn't go through the front plate. He couldn't hit the flank. He was trapped, staring down the barrel of his own death. Then he saw it. Not a weak spot in the armor, but a flaw in the design. A necessity. A tiny, vulnerable aperture on the driver's side of the massive glassy plate, the driver's viewport. A thick block of armored glass and steel, perhaps 6 inches by 8. It was still heavily armored, but compared to the homogeneous steel around it, it was a crack in the fortress wall. Hitting it was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance. Hitting it with enough force and the right angle to do more than scratch it was a fantasy. It was the only shot he had. "Pete," Eli's voice was a calm, dispassionate whisper over the intercom, a stark contrast to the bedlam. "The hull is cocked 3 degrees left. I need 2 degrees back to the right. Use the right track only. Bump it. 1 second. On my mark." "Eli, for God's sake," Pete began. "Mark." Pete, acting on pure instinct, slammed the right steering lever. The intact right track dug into the frozen ground, the crippled tank shuddering, the hull groaning as it twisted a minuscule amount on its broken left side. In Eli's scope, the crosshairs drifted across the king tiger's hull. He ignored the massive gun barrel now centering for the kill shot. He ignored the machine gun fire from the Panzer Grenadiers pinging and sparking off their armor like angry hornets. His world was the tiny, dark rectangle of the viewport. It was there, perfectly centered. He did not jerk the trigger. He did not stomp. He applied a steady, increasing pressure with his index finger on the custom brass mechanism, a squeeze as smooth and controlled as the release of a watch's mainspring. The 75 mm roared. The shell, an M61 armor-piercing capped round, left the barrel. Eli, through his magnified scope, tracked its entire flight. It was a gray streak against the white and gray background, unwavering, true, a projectile guided by a watchmaker's intent. It struck the king tiger not on the mighty glassy plate, but directly on the driver's viewport. The impact was not the clean, sparking ricochet of a failed penetration. It was a brutal, inward crunch. The armored glass and steel housing disintegrated under the focused force. The shell, its momentum only partially spent, punched through into the driver's compartment. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The king tiger continued to loom, its gun still aimed. Then, a flash of orange from within the viewport, the initial detonation of the shell's filler. A split second later, a secondary, cataclysmic explosion tore the beast apart from the inside. The turret, weighing over 20 tons, was lifted off its race by the force of the ammunition cook-off, landing upside down in the snow with a ground-shaking thud. The hull split open like a rotten fruit, vomiting fire and black smoke into the sky. The impossible shot had found its mark. The silence that followed was more deafening than the explosion. It was broken by the frantic close-range chatter of German MP-40s. A metallic clang echoed through the avenging angel's hull, followed by another. It was the sound of a grenade being tapped against the steel, a final, grim courtesy from the Panzer Grenadiers who were now upon them. The grenades never exploded. Instead, the sharp, aggressive reports of American M1 Garens and the heavier thump of a Browning automatic rifle erupted from the treeline. The German shouts turned to screams of surprise and pain. The tapping on the hull ceased, replaced by the sounds of retreating footsteps and frantic firefights that quickly faded into the fog. An American infantry counterattack had arrived in the final, impossible seconds. The hatches of the Avenging Angel were wrenched open from the outside, letting in a blast of frigid, smoke-tainted air. The world outside was a landscape of gray and white, now stained with the black of oil and the darker red of blood. Medics moved through the field, their voices low and urgent, tending to the wounded and covering the dead. The ruined husk of the king tiger still burned, a pyre that cast flickering, hellish shadows across the snow. The smell was indescribable, a cocktail of burnt explosives, diesel, cooking metal, and the sweet, coppery odor of death. Eli Vance stumbled out of the tank, his legs buckling under him. He fell to his knees in the churned, frozen mud, his body trembling not from the cold, but from a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He stared at the destroyed German behemoth, at the men, boys, really, lying motionless in the snow around it. There was no triumph in him, no glory, only a hollow, weary emptiness. He had kept his promise. He had fixed what was broken, not with vengeance, but with precision. The heretical setup, the impossible shot, it had all been an extension of the lessons from a quiet workshop and a Pennsylvania field. It was an answer to chaos, written in the language of geometry and physics. Top, Garcia, and Pete gathered around him, their faces smudged with soot and etched with the same stunned vacancy. They were alive. The ghost of the Ardennes had survived its encounter with the king. But the cost of that survival was written across the field, in the broken steel and broken bodies. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of his brother Michael. The edges were frayed, the image faded. He looked from the smiling face in the picture to the smoldering wreck of the King Tiger, and he understood. He hadn't avenged anyone. He had simply used the skills his brother and his family had given him to survive another day in a world gone mad. That was the only victory the war offered. The legacy of the sniper Sherman would be born in the stories the infantry would tell, but for Eli, the legacy was the weight of the silence, the ghost of the clockwork heart that had beaten just once, perfectly, to keep the chaos at bay. And in the quiet that followed the storm, the only thing left was the ticking of cooling metal, a ghost of the clockwork heart that had won the day. If this story of ingenuity and survival against impossible odds resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to see that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in following the rules, but in having the courage to rewrite them.